Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Rebecca Vallis. I'm a distinguished fellow and senior advisor here at the National Academy of Social Insurance. I'm a white woman with gold kind of wing-shaped earrings and long brown curly hair, wearing a black sports jacket. And I'm seated in front of a backdrop of a whole bunch of books that are all about social insurance because I'm seated in the National Academy of Social Insurance's library. And on behalf of the Academy, it is my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's event on humanizing the Social Security Administration's administrative budget. That's a mouthful. Now, a federal agency's administrative funding might sound like a dry, wonky topic, but whether or not a critical agency like the Social Security Administration has sufficient resources to run its programs makes a world of difference to the people that its benefits are there to protect. In just one horrifying example, about 10,000 people die every year waiting for disability benefits, according to the Government Accountability Office, because of egregious backlogs in disability determinations that are the result of double-digit declines in SSA's administrative budget and staffing levels over the past decade. So following the release of President Biden's fiscal year 2025 budget and a whirlwind of congressional hearings last week on Social Security's administrative budget, I'm incredibly excited to have the privilege today to moderate an all-star panel of some of the nation's leading experts on this issue to help us cut through the facts, the figures, and percentage points, and to ask the question, what do years of declines in SSA's administrative budget mean for the people that the agency serves? And I'll welcome them to join me on the virtual dais now by turning on their cameras. We are so pleased to be joined today by Kathleen Romig, who is, I believe today is her very first day on a detail at the Social Security Administration. Most of you may be familiar with her time at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, but welcome to SSA, Kathleen. Jeff Cruz with the American Federation of Government Employees, or AFG. Jeff, thanks for being with us today. Manasi Deshpande, a researcher with the University of Chicago, who almost needs no introduction because I think the Academy's community is very, very familiar with your research, Manasi. Thanks for being with us today. And last but certainly not least, Darcy Milburn, who's with the ARC of the United States. Darcy, it's great to have you with us today. And you're a brand new member of the Academy, so welcome. So really pleased to have this amazing lineup joining us for this conversation today. I also want to thank our captioner for helping us make the event accessible. Today, we're going to hear first from our panel, and then we're going to be leaving time for questions at the end. So if you see the little Q&A function in Zoom, that's where you can put your questions. Feel free to put them in at any point during the event, and we'll be leaving some time for questions at the end. So Kathleen, I want to start with you. I think of you sort of within the social insurance community as kind of one of the queens of the Social Security Administration administrative budget issue. You are extremely, extremely expert when it comes to the trends that we've seen, the dollars and cents. Talk a little bit about SSA's administrative budget. And I mentioned double-digit declines in overall budget and staffing. Talk a little bit about how we got there and what the state of SSA's administrative funding is today.
Sure. And so, one thing that a lot of people don't know about SSA is that the funding for customer service that you've been talking about, Rebecca, is financed through the annual appropriations process. It's not like the rest of the agency's funding for Social Security benefits and SSI benefits, which are sometimes disparagingly called entitlements, but that means that that funding happens automatically. Instead, the funding for SSA customer service is subject to this very fierce competition every year for dollars, and often subject to huge delays as appropriators, kick the can down the road for, this year it was almost 6 months, trying to figure out how much they were going to allocate for different federal programs. And so that has really put the squeeze on Social Security Administration customer service. And things really got bad starting in 2010, when there were these very strict discretionary budget caps. For you nerds out there, that was the fiscal cliff. That's what they called it. That was triggered by another debt ceiling showdown. And so there were very strict discretionary budget caps, very, very stiff competition for dollars. And SSA has lost a lot of those battles. So that since 2010, the agency's funding is down 19% after inflation. 19%. And at the same time, over that same period, the agency is serving 13 million more people. That's 24% more people with a 19% smaller budget. So as you can imagine, this is just really putting the squeeze on people, and on people both on SSA staff, and then of course, more importantly, on the SSA's applicants and beneficiaries. So, SSA's funding is almost all goes towards staff. That's so those are the people who make the agency run, and the staffing levels are at about a 25-year low. They're down 11%, and they're on a track to go down even lower because the agency has frozen hiring once again.
A lot of numbers in there, but I feel like that's
Yeah.
the point you kind of have to start to be able to put a human face on the consequences of those declines. Kathleen, I'm going to turn next to Jeff and ask Jeff, talk a little bit about how some of the declines in administrative funding that Kathleen was just walking through are impacting customer service for claimants, for beneficiaries. She talked a little bit about how staffing is really a core part of this. Your union really is the staff of this agency that we're talking about. How do declines in staffing play in as well? Oh, and Jeff, you're on mute, which
I realize that. So thank you. Yeah, no, it's really, hurting the ability of the agency to serve the public. I think in your introduction, you talked about the disability backlog, people pay into the system, they earn the benefit. And then when you become disabled, you have a 220-day wait period just for your initial decision. Most of those come back negative, and then you could wait up to another 2 years before you get your appeals decision. And so I think you mentioned, 10,000 Americans, roughly die while waiting for that decision. Another 5,000 have to declare bankruptcy. So that, this has a lot of severe consequences for the public. I'll talk a little bit about the teleservice center, that gets a lot of attention when you dial in. And so, I went back and looked. The earliest data from 2007, it was under a 5-minute wait in February to get your call answered. 2010, it was under 4 minutes if you called. 2015 starts to creep up to 10 minutes. 2020, 16 minutes. Today, and all of last year, it's 36 minutes to get your phone call answered. And so, this also kind of is like a death spiral of impact. Because if you're a call center operator and someone is waiting 36 minutes to get a call, and keep in mind, the old system, it doesn't give you an estimated wait time. A lot of modern systems, you could just leave your phone number and then, you get a call back 36 minutes later. These are people listening to, I'm sure the music's good, but listening to some kind of music, having no idea when their phone call's answered. So, they're a little bit cranky when the phone call gets answered, and you see attrition rates in our teleservice center, over 25%, around 25%. And, that's a big problem too, because, when you hire new people, their first day, they may get locked out of their office, and unless they're really amazing, they're not going to be productive. But, there's a lot of training. It takes a lot of time to get up to speed and really become efficient. And so, for a lot of questions, it could be a year or two before you're really, getting max efficiency in answering calls. And so losing people just really hurts the agency.
Yeah, and just to underscore the 1-800 numbers, right? I mean, it's easy to think, okay, well, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 36 minutes, what does that mean? Well, when the reason that you're calling is because your benefits have been cut off, or because you need to get an earnings report through, or because there's something going on and you need an answer, maybe you got an overpayment notice and you don't know what to do with it, right? You're calling that 1-800 number, and often people are calling who don't have a lot of time. Maybe they're in between two jobs, maybe they're on a cell phone that has limited minutes, whatever the situation is, right? I mean, I don't know who has 36 minutes to wait on hold but certainly not for really important pressing questions about something like your survival income. Darcy, I'm going to go to you next, because we've referenced the disability backlogs a couple of times. Jeff has talked a little bit about some of this as well, but disability backlogs, and specifically backlogs in disability determinations, are a huge part of the picture. Talk a little bit about the impact of Social Security's customer service crisis and the declines that Kathleen was walking through in administrative resources for the disability community, as we put a human face on what the consequences are here.
Yeah, thanks so much. I would say that the term customer service crisis is an accurate one, but it also sanitizes what's actually happening on the ground. What's happening in terms of real people's experiences is these delays are causing destabilizing losses in income and benefits that they're eligible for. It's dehumanizing, and honestly, it can also be deadly. The situation is dire, and people with disabilities are paying the price. Initial disability claims are now over 1.1 million people, which is actually almost double what they were at the end of fiscal year 2019. As Jeff mentioned, disability applicants are waiting nearly 8 months for an initial decision, an additional 7 months for those who request a reconsideration. So that means it can take over a year for a typical claimant to make it through a reconsideration stage. And as I mentioned about what that actually means is that people are going without benefits that they require to put food on the table, to make rent that month, to keep the lights on, to keep gas in the tank, and that gas that they may need in order to get to their job in the first place. And one of the things that we hear from the people we serve is that a cutoff in benefits can be absolutely destabilizing to them. Losing benefits can mean losing their ability to get to work, losing jobs, losing their housing security, and can create this negative feedback loop that can be really dangerous for people and their families.
Yeah, and Darcy, staying with you just for a moment, just because I feel like the 1-800 number is one of those issues that really deserves some attention. It isn't just about waiting for someone to answer the call, right? It's often people aren't able to get through, and this is something that especially impacts the disability community. I hear this from disability advocates, including you, all the time. Talk a little bit about some of the consequences specifically for disability beneficiaries who are working and trying to report their earnings, but who can't get through on the 1-800 number.
Yeah, so people who have not had the experience of receiving disability benefits don't always understand just how complicated it can be to navigate the systems and the array of complicated paperwork and rules. And so people that now try to reach the SSA by phone are waiting on hold for 38 minutes. And we've heard from an alarming number of people who are wrongfully losing access to their benefits or having their benefits reduced because they were unable to get through to the SSA on the 1-800 line. As a result, people often need to go and see people in person. As SSA is dealing with budget cuts, it's really difficult for people to go to offices and wait to get assistance. And it can affect people's ability to be able to get these benefits that are so critical to them.
So more that we can get into there, but Manasi, I want to bring you in because you have some of the most relevant and important research on this exact issue. You've done an enormous array of research that relates to Social Security's programs, especially the disability programs, but some of your research in particular has looked at changes and declines in Social Security's customer service, such as field office closures, congestion in the offices, wait times like we've been hearing about. And what your research has looked at is what is the impact on who's able to access disability benefits, or as one of the titles of your research actually says, who gets screened out. Talk a little bit about your research and some of what you find comes from these types of declines.
Yeah, so what we did in that paper was we looked at about 120 Social Security field office closings that had happened between the years of 2000 and 2015. And the strategy here is that we're using offices that close in the future as controls for offices that close in the present. And what we find is that when field offices close, we see very large reductions in disability applications in neighboring communities. So we see about a 10% reduction in applications in neighboring communities. And we actually see an even larger decline, about 16% in new awards in neighboring communities. And what that comparison means, the 10% versus the 16%, what that means is that these closings are not just discouraging people who would have been rejected from disability benefits from applying, that it's actually disproportionately discouraging people who would have been allowed onto benefits from applying for benefits. And then when we look at which groups are most affected, I think the thing that stands out the most is that it's people with fewer resources, lower levels of education, lower income prior to applying for disability benefits. They experience just very large reductions in applications and awards as a result of these field office closings, whereas people with higher levels of education, college graduates, they don't experience these large declines. Basically, they seem to figure it out either by completing the application on their own, maybe they have access to representation, maybe they have more resources to get to another field office to get the assistance, but we really see these declines in applications and awards concentrated among low education applicants.
And I have,
yeah.
keep going. Sorry,
Oh,
Manasi.
go ahead.
Well, no, and I have to say, as you're describing that, of course, one of the things that's kind of popping into my head, which is one of the more concerning statistics within the realm of take-up rates or how many people who are eligible for these programs are actually helped by the benefits, is that about half of eligible people don't receive SSI. Right. And we wonder why that is. You're describing, I think, some of what actually creates those kinds of very, very concerning and low take-up rates. Is there any more you want to say about your research findings now before we come back and put them a little bit more in context?
Sure. Yeah. Just on the channels, we were interested in what exactly is it about field offices that, or the closing of field offices that is creating such a large discouragement effect. So you might imagine some hypotheses could be field offices provide information about these programs. Maybe when a field office closes, it's hard to travel to the next office. Maybe neighboring offices become more congested. And what we see is that a lot of this effect seems to be driven by a congestion effect, that when one field office closes, neighboring offices become more congested. So we see through many different measures that those neighboring offices are becoming more congested, higher processing times, et cetera, higher wait times. And what that means as a consequence is that it's not just the people around the office that was closed who are affected. It's now also the people in the communities of the neighboring offices, which are now more congested. And though we also see declines in those areas, because the neighboring offices are more congested and it's harder to get assistance with the application. So it's not just the people immediately around the closed office, it's sort of this network effect that even the people who are using the offices that are neighboring offices, we also see pretty large declines in applications and awards in those areas.
Which is extremely concerning. Obviously, I mean, you can kind of get the image of a heat map in your mind, right? Of like it starts in one spot and then the color spreads and it spreads, right? Kathleen, I'm going to come back to you because the new commissioner of Social Security, Martin O'Malley, who was confirmed just a couple of months ago and who really hit the ground running in the last few months and actually just did a whole whirlwind of testimony in front of Congress last week. Commissioner O'Malley testified before the House and the Senate, multiple committees, about what it would take for Social Security to be able to operate its programs and to be able to address some of the aspects of the customer service crisis that you've all been talking about today. Back to the dollars and cents. What does SSA actually need when it comes to additional administrative resources to address the crisis? And I ask that question, recognizing that it's probably helpful to put this both in terms of dollars and cents, but also, as you often do so well, into larger context. So help us understand where SSA is today and where it would need to be able to have the funding it needs.
Sure. So this year, SSA's administrative budget is about $14 billion, and $12 billion of that is for customer service and $2 billion is for what's known as program integrity, or making sure that people remain eligible for their benefits. So that sounds like a big number, 14 billion, but it's really not when you think about the volume of benefits that SSA pays. So this year, SSA is expected to pay out $1.5 trillion in benefits. So that overhead is less than 1% of its benefit payments. That is just an extraordinarily lean operation. And one thing that Commissioner O'Malley talked about last week when he was on the Hill is comparing that to what happens in the private sector for insurance companies, who pay out the kinds of claims that SSA does, but in the, disability insurance, life insurance, and other forms of insurance. And what he showed was that for example, Allstate, the overhead is 19%. For Liberty Mutual, it's more than 23%. So we're talking about way, way higher. So, I mean, if SSA's funding just went up a little bit, just another, another fraction of a percentage point each year, it could do so much more. And so what President Biden is asking for next year is a $1.2 billion increase over what the agency has gotten this year. That's about a 9% increase. Again, this is just a teeny, tiny fraction of what the agency is paying out in benefits. And that an increase like that would allow the agency to begin to rebuild, to begin to unfreeze hiring, to begin to start to make up for those staff losses, to improve the IT systems, so that we can modernize them and make the operation more efficient and more responsive to people's needs. So that's kind of what would be necessary to get started on it. But then, of course, significant and sustained increase in funding would be necessary to finish the work of improving customer service.
Folks who heard the commissioner testify on the Hill last week, or who have otherwise heard him talk about this issue, right? Liberty Mutual, he'll often say Liberty, Bibberty, because people are familiar with those commercials, right? But these kinds of companies, I mean, they operate at something closer to a 20% overhead, right? It's a comparison, right, between the private sector and what SSA is doing, just to underscore that comparison. Jeff, I want to bring you back in on this point because I'd like to give you the chance to react to those numbers, some of which are the president's fiscal year 25 budget proposal when it comes to SSA's administrative funding, but also, what does AFG think that the agency actually needs to be able to get back to the staffing levels that it needs to address the customer service crisis?
Sure. So, I think as Kathleen said, they got $100 million in increased funding from 14.1 billion to 14.2. That is less than 1%. That's, 0.6%. Again, in real terms, inflation is much higher than that. So again, we're seeing another year where in real terms, Social Security is cut. That said, I do want to take a second to say, we're glad that they kept government running. Even when you don't have a shutdown, it's a huge burden on our employees to be faced with a shutdown and faced with, being forced to work without a paycheck. So, when we talk about recruitment and retention, getting close to a shutdown has a huge impact. It costs thousands of hours of, people preparing for a shutdown. And so, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the negative impacts of even just coming close to a shutdown on people. We're supportive of the president's request. It's a step in the right direction. It would mean 79 million to hire new teleservice center employees, 1.7 to modernize IT. I talked a little bit about the phone system before, but that could also save, for example, if someone comes to a field office and they have a green card or an immigration document, they need to bring the physical card and show it. We can't take it because they need that. If we update our IT, we could just, email, I don't know if it's an email, but some way, Department of Homeland Security, is this valid? And they would be like, yes. And you could do it without requiring them to come in and saving a lot of time. So, we think some IT improvements could save time. But, the president's request is not sufficient. It's a political ask based on, what they think, they could get. And I don't know their calculations. AFGE, we're asking for, over 17 billion, to kind of really restore the service they offered, even as recent as, 12, 15 years ago. Our number isn't based on politics. It's, what we think the agency needs to really restore service. So, we're, already fighting for FY25. We're also proposing, and the reason why labor HHS, Health and Human Services, where, SSA funding is such a tough appropriations bill. It competes against so many other priorities for a lot of members. It's a really, tough spot to be. So we're kind of looking at two other potential, solutions. One, in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS was given a pot of money, initially 80 billion, now it's 60 billion. They clawed some back, but that they could use, however they see fit over the next 10 years. And we've seen their service really just, wait times go way down. Now, if you call, you get your phone call answered. And, the Senate voted, 75% or so in favor of O'Malley. So, now that they've confirmed and, a lot of people think he is the leader for the agency, we would love to see Congress support him and give him, a $20 billion supplemental funding, which, if you do the math, that's about 2 billion more a year. That puts us towards that kind of same number. O'Malley was asking 1.2%. I think that's about 19 billion a year or so. So there's a couple different asks out there. But going back to labor HHS, there's a good argument to be made that it shouldn't be subject to the spending caps and competing with other programs because it has its own revenue stream, and fee-based programs are treated differently. Since there is a FICA tax and dedicated revenue stream, there's a lot of arguments for this, mostly made by people a lot smarter than me. So don't ask me about all the lawyerly details, but a lot of people think it could be done, even potentially without not necessarily an act of Congress, that the chairman could just score it, by themselves. And so, there's different ways to implement that wouldn't necessarily require a full congressional vote.
Yeah, not a new idea, right? The idea of taking Social Security's administrative budget off budget, right? So it's not having to compete with other non-defense discretionary budget priorities for resources that are really actually coming from the trust fund, right? So a really important point to bring in as well. Manasi, I want to go back to you because we're getting a number of questions in the chat or in the Q&A specifically about your research. You've hit I think a chord here. And so I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about your findings. And I'm curious if you want to take the findings from your research and extrapolate a little bit to weigh in on the implications for the budget conversation here. So I'm, one person might say to you, hey, drop in disability claims, doesn't that mean budget savings? Isn't that maybe an okay thing? Shouldn't we see that as okay? How do you respond to that? And is there anything else that you would like to say in terms of the long-term and broader consequences that flow from the discouragement effect that you see when customer service declines?
Yeah, so a few points on that from the research. I guess, when we started studying this question, I think like a lot of people, we thought that, a lot of information is available online. The SSDI application is available online. Now the SSI application is as well. At the time of the study, SSI application was not available online, but there were certainly a lot of resources available online. And so other people maybe thought we're not going to find that big of an effect because people can access information online and that can help them complete the application themselves, or at least with minimal assistance. And we were just very surprised by the magnitude of the discouragement effects that we found from these office closings. It became very clear that, especially for applicants with low education levels, low income levels, that the in-person information and assistance provided by field offices is critical to their decision to apply for disability benefits. And so without that in-person information and assistance, we see just extremely large reductions in applications and awards among low income and low education applicants in particular. And so, when we in terms of extrapolating to customer service, I think that's probably, the most that we can say, that that reductions in customer service are likely to have similar effects. We think that, again, most of this effect on field office closings is operating through congestion effects that maybe the office doesn't have the resources to help everybody who comes in or everybody who calls in, and those people just don't apply. And those are long-term effects. So you might have thought that, again, these are sort of temporary effects, that people see that the office is closed, but then they kind of figure out what to do. And that's just not what happens. So what we see in the paper is that, again, especially for applicants with limited resources, these are very persistent effects, that even 2-3 years after the office closing, we see no attenuation of this discouragement effect. Essentially, it's just as persistent as it was immediately after the office closed. And so it's not just a kind of temporary transition phase where people figure out how to do it and they eventually submit their application. These are basically permanent reductions in the number of applications and awards that are happening as a result of field office closings.
So I'll extrapolate in ways that you might not be able to, but it sounds like what you're saying is that the decisions that are made about how much SSA gets in its administrative budget are not just going to have consequences for the coming fiscal year. It sounds like your research suggests that those consequences actually flow out for much longer periods of time. And so we're talking about something that has already been going on for over a decade in terms of the declines in administrative resources that Kathleen was giving us the retrospective on. But even if we do start to see a reversal in that trend, we're not just talking about digging out of a serious hole. We're also talking about something that is already having very long-term flowing consequences. Is that fair to say?
I think that is fair to say, that in the paper we find very long-term effects of field office closings, and that's very likely operating through reductions in customer service.
So more questions for you in the Q&A that we're going to come back to in a moment. But Darcy, I want to go back to you. The most of the benefits that are paid by the Social Security Administration are for retirement and survivors benefits. The disability programs are actually a much smaller share overall of benefits that are paid. And actually, if I'm getting this right, the SSI program is actually just about 5% of outlays from the agency, but roughly half of the Social Security Administration's administrative budget is actually spent administering disability benefits. Big part of that is because the programs, as you noted before, are so extraordinarily complex. I'm curious if you would talk a little bit about how the complexity of, in particular, the SSI program fits in, things like asset rules, income rules, many of which have not been updated in a very long time, if ever. And as you speak about that, if you could speak a little bit to whether updating the SSI program would reduce the administrative burden on SSA in the broader context of scarce resources as we talk about this today.
Yes, thanks so much for mentioning SSI. It's a absolutely fundamentally important program for people with disabilities. It serves around 8 million people, including 1 million children. And it really is incredibly difficult, not just to get benefits, but maintain them, in part due to long outdated rules. And as you mentioned, administrating SSI is extraordinarily expensive. One of the rules that I'll mention is called the asset limit. And folks on this call are familiar. The asset limit has not been raised since 1984, and it's only $2,000. So individuals on SSI are not allowed to have more than a total of $2,000 in financial resources. That's the total sum of their cash on hand, stocks, savings, checking accounts, life insurance policies over a certain amount of money, as well as some personal property. And administering this rule is incredibly complex. Applicants have to answer dozens of questions about their resources. They have to provide detailed documentation, which SSA employees have to review and process. And federal law requires SSA to verify applicants' cash, bank accounts, stocks, burial funds, and more. And as a result, SSA's asset limits make SSI more costly to administer. So it's SSI costs roughly 80% of what it costs SSA to run the much larger Social Security program, which serves 8 times more people as SSI. And updating SSI's archaic asset caps would simplify one of the agency's most costly workloads, saving taxpayer dollars and also improving the quality of life for people that depend on this program. Another thing worth noting is that the asset limit is a key driver of overpayments among individuals on SSI. Overpayments happen when an individual is found to be ineligible for benefits in a given month, and SSA makes a determination that that an individual received benefits that they may not have supposed to have received according to their rule books, and that can lead individuals to be hit with a demand from the SSA to pay back benefits that they have been paid. And when it comes to individuals on SSI, having to pay back benefits is like trying to get blood from a stone. And raising the SSI asset limit would prevent a great proportion of overpayments among people on SSI.
A hugely important issue, and definitely something we heard a lot about from the commissioner actually last week in his tour across the Hill, overpayments and some changes the agency is making. These are conversations I'm sure we'll have more at the Academy in the coming weeks, but just a huge and important link to the administrative burden conversation. And that's definitely something we've also been getting some questions about in the Q&A. I'm curious if any of our other panelists want to comment on simplification of SSI or other Social Security Administration processes or policies as part of what we should be thinking about when it comes to the customer service crisis and also SSA's administrative resources. Jeff?
Sure, I'll just focus on the WEP and GPO. That's the windfall elimination provision and government pension offset. Now, I don't have a scientific survey, but, I always ask our teleservice center folks when I talk to them, how many calls do you get on WEP GPO? And it seems like, maybe around 20% total unscientific survey, but, that's what I usually get is, a huge amount of calls are WEP GPO. And they're also the worst calls our people deal with. Because they're basically telling people they're not getting their benefits. People are rightly upset. I mean, I am glad my job isn't to talk to people and to, tell them why they're not getting, their promised benefit. They think it's unfair. We think it's unfair as a union. Of course, a lot of older federal workers are impacted as well. So, something like getting rid of the WEP and GPO could have a really, really huge positive difference in reducing the workload coming in. So, we see that as one way you could really help, improve customer service by simplifying the program. And I'm sure Kathleen probably has like 20 or 30 better ideas, but that's, would be our, priority.
Kathleen, is there anything you want to add to that theme, simplification as something that could also be?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I would say, as you said, I've been working on SSA budget for many years now. And when we go up to the Hill and we talk about it, often what the members and staffers say is that they want SSA to do more with less. They want to find efficiencies. But at the same time, they don't acknowledge that many of those inefficiencies are written right into the law. And that it's just, especially SSI, but SSDI as well, are just extraordinarily convoluted programs to administer. And there's no way to make those rules more efficient when they're on the books that way. And so the way that if you want true program simplification, you have to go back and change those rules. And so that they are transparent to applicants and beneficiaries, and they are efficient for staff to administer.
So Manasi, I want to toss a question to you that's come in through the Q&A and lots of interest in your research. And someone asked if I could share, Manasi, a link to her paper. So I did that. sorry, in the Q&A. We don't have a chat function for this webinar. So if anyone's looking for a link to that, you can go and look in the answered questions in the Q&A. But Manasi, one of the questions that's come through is, do we know anything about where the office closures that you looked at are geographically located, and were they equitably distributed? Was there anything more you can say as we kind of mentioned that heat map?
Yeah, there is a map in the paper of the specific closings that we look at, and there is definitely clustering. So there are a number across the country, but there are also some clusters in New York City, for example, I think in the Los Angeles area. And one of the things that's notable is that we find large reductions in applications and awards, even when there is a neighboring office very close by. And that's actually what leads us to this conclusion that it's really about congestion rather than travel time. That even when there's a neighboring office pretty close by, we still see large reduction. Like, for example, in New York City, there were a lot of offices there. Some of them were closed, and even though there's one that's relatively close by, we still see large reductions in applications and awards in that area. And so that suggests that it's not so much about the burden of traveling to the next office as it is that the neighboring offices are going to be busier because they have more people to serve.
So one other related question, which I'll throw your way while we're taking all these questions that are very interested in your research. Interested if you would speak more to the discouragement effect and how that shows up over time. And also, do you have any evidence? Have you looked at whether a new field office opening affects applications for disability benefits?
Yeah, both great questions. So yeah, as I mentioned before, in the time period that we look at, which is 2 to 3 years after the field office closing, we don't see basically any change in the discouragement effect. It is just a drop in applications and awards, and then that continues for at least the next 2 to 3 years. So we don't look beyond 2 to 3 years. It's possible that it persists even longer than that. But that was something that surprised us, again, that it's not that people are surprised by the closing and then they go and figure it out or go to another office and submit their application that way, is that they appear to be basically permanently discouraged from submitting an application, even people who would have been allowed onto benefits had they applied. And so I think that's what makes the finding so striking, in part, that this is not a temporary change. It's actually creating some permanent effects on people's decisions to apply. And then in terms of the new field office openings, we haven't unfortunately been able to get data on new field office openings, but that would be a very interesting question to try to answer. Are the effects of an opening symmetric to the effects of a closing, or do they have different effects than a closing? It's a great question. We haven't been able to answer that yet.
Thank you for that. So Kathleen, I'm going to go back to you, and I'm going to ask us to sort of envision a parallel universe where maybe there's a different funding path for the Social Security Administration. I feel like I'm taking us into the science fiction portion of today's webinar, given the recent trends. But let's be optimists. Let's envision what we think could be instead of just what is. Talk a little bit about what a different funding path might be for SSA, what that would look like. And I'm curious, Jeff brought up before the IRS. Is there anything we can learn from what's happened?
That's what I was going to say. It's not science fiction, it's real life. And Jeff did make this point so well that, just 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed. And that gave the IRS a significant funding boost. And before that, the IRS was in a very, very similar place to Social Security Administration. Its customer service funding had been starved for over a decade for exactly the same reasons, because of these discretionary budget caps, because of short-sighted, penny-wise, pound-foolish policymaking. They were in exactly the same situation, if not worse. 9 out of 10 calls to the IRS went unanswered. I remember during the pandemic when those child tax credit payments were going out, my sister called me and she said, it went to the wrong bank account. What do? I keep calling the IRS over and over, and there's just no answer. Nobody's picking up the phone. It took her weeks to sort it out because she could not get a human being on the phone to just change the bank account information. It was very straightforward. So, but that was true of 9 out of 10 people at that stage of the game. And as recently as last year, the wait time on the IRS, or a little over a year ago, was 28 minutes on the phone. And you know what it is now? 3 minutes. So that is a reality that is within reach. You know, it's just, you know, from one tax year to the next went from a 28-minute wait on the phone to a 3-minute. That's what funding can do, because it can hire more people, like Jeff said, in those teleservice centers. And so they can pick up the phone quickly. It can have more people processing claims, so they're not waiting in these queues forever and ever, for months and even years waiting for a decision. It can really speed things up, and it can prevent problems from ballooning. You know, Rebecca, you brought up overpayments. One reason that overpayments can become so large is because it takes so long to process changes or to detect overpayments. And so by the time a beneficiary finds out about them, they're tens of thousands of dollars. And that it just doesn't have to be that way. Not if there's sufficient staff to keep up on these workloads, then these problems don't have to balloon to become out of control. And we can see it's very much real life. That's exactly the experience at the IRS. And the other thing they're doing is investing in technology there. And so it's, you know, much more modern, consumer friendly technology, stuff like secure messaging and live chat and virtual assistant, things like that they've just developed in the last year. And even in, you know, online filing for taxes, the direct file that they're doing there. I mean, there's just so much exciting stuff going on. And like I said, it's been under 2 years there. I mean, it can be a dramatic turnaround, you know, with sufficient investment.
Yeah, Jeff, I don't know if there's anything more you want to add on that point, because you brought up the IRS before, just sort of very briefly. And I'm also curious, as I throw you that question, something we haven't talked about, but which I know is a real concern for you and for your people, is morale, and what morale is looking like at the Social Security Administration, and why that matters, and how that actually impacts the customer service that people receive.
Sure. I mean, the thing I would add to Kathleen, she did an excellent job covering it, is just, you know, the economic impact of Social Security, particularly to certain communities. I was just in Puerto Rico about 2 weeks ago. They closed the only field office in San Juan, Puerto Rico, about a year from today. And so luckily SSA committed to reopening it. So that was a good news on the trip. But if you look at seniors, it's such an important in Puerto Rico and everywhere. You know, I think you have 4/10 of people that, you know, rely on it for the majority of their income, or Kathleen probably has the exact stat, but, you know, they need this money right away and they pump it into the economy, and you see this having, you know, millions and millions of dollars of economic input. Congressional offices know this. They get more calls from people needing help on SSA than pretty much anything else. So, you know, they know there's a problem. And then, I'm sorry, you asked me another question at the very end and I forgot.
No, I really appreciate you adding all of that, but I threw you a two-parter, which is deeply
Yes.
unfair as the moderator. So that the other part, and I actually, I want to give you a chance to speak to this, because I feel like it's really important for us to bring up here, is morale.
Yeah.
What is morale looking like at the Social Security staff level, and why does that matter? Not just from the standpoint of we care about, you know, 60,000 or so federal employees, but how does that actually relate to the customer service that people receive?
Yeah, morale is terrible at the agency. There's no way around it. So the government does surveys of every large federal agency. There's 17. And if you look back 20 years ago, SSA was, at one point it was number one. I'm not sure exactly 20 years ago, but it was one or towards the top. And you could see over time it slowly go lower and lower. And I think 2 years ago it was 16 out of 17. And then last year it finally made it to, you know, the worst spot, 17th out of 17th, the worst federal agency to work for. And so there's a lot of problems with recruitment. There's a lot of people problems retaining. We see really, really high attrition rates. You know, people feel overworked. SSA doesn't offer, you know, competitive benefits from other agencies. We're the only one of the 17 agencies that doesn't offer any kind of student loan repayment program. We don't offer childcare assistance. Some agencies have centers and, you know, offer different subsidies and assistance. SSA doesn't offer that. So, you know, if you're a young person out of college, you know, you have a student debt, you just have a child, and you could get, you know, another agency's trying to steal you from SSA, of course you're going to leave the agency and go to, you know, whatever the agency is. But, 20 years ago, SSA used to be stealing people. I shouldn't say stealing. People would want to leave and come to SSA. Right now it's the exact opposite. We're losing people to other agencies. We're losing people to the private sector. And, that's problematic. I think it was Senator Hatch, maybe, this is an old quote, but, he said that there's more training required to go into space. I think it was Bill Nelson, I'm sorry, from Florida. But there's more training required of astronauts to go into space than for certain SSA positions that require kind of years and years. I think he might have been exaggerating a little bit, but the point is a lot of these positions have, years and years of training before you fully get up to speed. And then, you've also seen job descriptions kind of bleed into each other. So we have, a claims specialist. They're supposed to handle the regular kind of claims. That's what they're trained for. That's their job. But because of the shortage, now they're just answering phones and doing general, inquiries, which they may not be efficient at. They're taking walk-ins, and then they're also doing more complicated cases, but they're not getting paid more. We have different positions that, are supposed to do the complicated, but now they're doing 4 jobs without any increase of pay. So of course, you're not going to have as much time to do claims, and you're going to be stressed out. And the morale is really, really low. And, hopefully we can change that. I do want to talk, if I could just talk a little bit more about O'Malley's confirmation. He is a very charismatic leader. We definitely feel he is the person to bring the agency. He's done a lot of good things, to kind of speed up the process. I think our only complaint would be on telework, where he's kind of like the Michael Corleone of telework. Everyone likes him. He expanded episodic telework, which is great. That's if, your car breaks down, your kid gets sick, there's an emergency, he made a process easier for people to get episodic. And, that's great. But, how often is that used? Episodically. It's in the name. It's not very frequent. Meanwhile, he kind of doubled or tripled and just, he was confirmed in December. And, by the end of January, he announced that everyone at headquarters and, everyone that wasn't in our collective bargaining for field and teleservice, he doubled or even tripled the amount of time they have to go back in the office. And so, he's really been, and this is thousands of people every day, every week, multiple days. I haven't gone back and looked, but I think he's probably cut telework more than any other commissioner in the history of the agency. I'm going to double check that stat. But that would be our one gripe. As a union, he's really kind of gone after telework. But even there, to his credit, he did it very quick in January. But he did give employees until, it hasn't gone into effect until another week. I think it's April 7th or so. And so, we've seen some agencies where like, you got to come in Mondays starting next week, and, it causes all kinds of chaos. So, to his credit, even though we're not happy of the message, he did give folks a long time to adjust and plan. So sometimes little stuff could kind of make bad decisions less worse. And so that's kind of where we're at on that. But yeah, morale's low. Sorry, I went on a bunch of different tangents.
Appreciate that, Jeff. But morale being low, right? I mean, again, obviously, I think we all care about the Social Security employees just because they're people and also they're public servants. But also, that connects to and then actually translates into how people's customer service is actually experienced, right? There's people on the other end of those Social Security employee interactions, whether it's the person who's on the 1-800 number or the person who's in the field office. And so, if your desk is full of work that you don't have bandwidth to get to and you're pulled in 18 directions, right? Obviously your ability to be a human and to be kind and to interact with people who are often in some of the most challenging situations they've encountered in their lives is going to be diminished. So I don't want to lose that human component of why the morale that can decline so rapidly because of the customer service crisis's impact on the employees. I don't want to lose that thread either. I want to give one more opportunity to folks who are watching to put questions in the Q&A box. We've been answering some of them as we've gone, but please jump in with additional questions. I'm going to do sort of a last call as we move into the last chapter of this panel. I got the question and I'll just go ahead and answer it now. Someone asked, will the recording be available? Yes, it will. It will probably be up on the Academy's website about a week or so after the event is over. So yes, the recording will be available. So let me get that one out of the system. And Jeff, you're getting some appreciation for the Michael Corleone of telework, whatever people may feel about their positions on that. So there you go. Kathleen, there's a follow-up question in the Q&A about what the IRS has done with additional resources, and are there similarities across the agencies, or are there differences across the agencies that we should be aware of as we think about whether the IRS is a model for SSA?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of similarities. I mean, when you think about the tax code, I was saying SSA's rules are convoluted. I mean, IRS's rules might be even more convoluted. And so we're talking about a highly complex agency. We're talking about a huge, huge volume of people that interact with it every year, just like SSA. So those elements are really similar. And as far as how they invested those resources, a lot of it was into customer service staffing. So things like having a teleservice center that where citizens can call in. That's a really important thing. Things like making online application application in SSA's form, tax returns, and IRS's form. IRS is piloting right now direct file in certain states, and SSA is working to develop an online SSI application for some applicants that would be, it's still in progress, but investing in projects like that could really improve customer service and create efficiency at the agency. So I mean, I think that it's all these government IT systems, they're legacy systems, and they kind of build on top of one another. They're held together with like string and duct tape, so there's a trying to excavate that, trying to like replace manual processing. IRS did an awful lot of manual and still does, I'm sure, but like they're moving away from an awful lot of manual processing toward more modern digital processing techniques. And so a lot of that is very, very similar. There's a lot to be learned there. And the VA as well. The VA has undergone a lot of modernization, again, because of significant and sustained investment in customer service, and they have really turned their customer service situation around at VA too. So there are models out there, and VA is another similar agency in terms of complexity, scope, and importance to the citizens who use the service.
Really helpful. Thank you so much for that, Kathleen. So I'm not seeing additional questions come in. I think we've gotten through most of them. Manasi, I don't know if you want to take this one because it isn't quite within the scope of what we're talking about today, but just in case it's helpful, there's a PhD student who's watching, doing research on disability and Social Security benefit access, specifically people living with multiple sclerosis. This researcher says they are soliciting participants. And do you have any suggestions on where to solicit participants outside social media or the National Multiple Sclerosis Society website? So I don't know if you want to offer that researcher any insight.
That one I would need to think about. I wonder if anybody else on the call has ideas.
You're probably the best situated for that one. So how about this? Sandy Johnson, thank you for the question. And we want to support you in being able to do your research. So I'm going to suggest that you get in touch with Manasi directly, and she may be able to offer you some thoughts offline. But thank you for the question, Sandy. Great. Okay. So what I'm going to do is sort of a lightning round to close us out here is I'm going to give each of you a chance to sort of wrap up a little bit. And the question that I'm going to throw first to Darcy and to Jeff is whether you have a message to Congress and federal policymakers who are appropriators in particular about the importance of adequate administrative funding for the agency. And as I ask that question, please feel free to speak about why you view this as a bipartisan priority. Maybe Darcy, you want to take that first?
Absolutely. So I would say that delivering on the promise of critical programs like Social Security and SSI requires ensuring that individuals and families are able to access SSA's vital programs during their times of need. And unfortunately, as a recent GAO report found, over 100,000 people have passed away while they were waiting to receive disability benefits. We talk a lot about people falling through the holes in the safety net or people slipping through the cracks in the safety net, but for these individuals who ultimately are unable to access disability benefits in their time of need, the safety net did not exist. We see it as vital that Congress ensure that SSA has the resources to provide the high quality customer service that American citizens deserve, so that beneficiaries can access these lifeline benefits in an efficient and timely manner. And in terms of how it's a bipartisan effort, I truly believe that there's interest on both sides of the aisle in ensuring that that SSA can answer the call and answer the need for the beneficiaries of critical SSA programs.
I appreciate that, Darcy. And, you know, I often describe myself as a recovering legal aid lawyer who isn't recovering very well. I will never forget the first time I was representing a client who passed away while I was representing him before he was able to get the benefits. Most people who I think have a background where they've ever been advocates will never forget their first client that happened to, and it's a near universal experience for people who do any level of direct service work, because those experiences are so widespread. And the 100,000 something number you mentioned, right? That's a GAO report that's actually old at this point, even though it's the best thing, which is why we all still cite it. So countless more people have lost their lives since then. Jeff, I'm going to take the same question to you. Anything that AFG has in terms of a message to Congress and in particular to appropriators when it comes to why this issue is so important and why it should be a bipartisan priority.
Sure. First, I just want to address Catherine and ask a question about managed care of disability, which, you know, I'm not an expert on, but I do want to mention we've seen workers' compensation, which the Academy does have a lot of expertise on. We've seen a big shift over the past, 10, 15 years, where instead of someone getting injured on the job and getting workers' comp, these states are, doing everything they can to prevent that and shift them onto DI and SSDI. And so that is a problem that's, much more complicated than we could get into in our limited time, but I definitely wanted to make sure, people are aware of that. A lot of the disabilities should be workers' comp, but just states have really gutted their programs. As to what I would tell Congress, it's pretty simple. Social Security is the most beloved, trusted, and important government programs out there. It keeps millions of people out of poverty when they could no longer work because of age or disability. It's benefits people have earned, and we need to make sure they can access it. And that would be my message to Congress.
And Kathleen, I know you're now over at the Social Security Administration, and that's the capacity you're speaking to us in. And we're getting to see the backdrop of your brand new office today. Maybe some new resources to SSA will also allow you to join on your computer next time instead of having to be on your iPhone, living what we're talking about. But I want to give you the chance to sort of speak to that as well in whatever way you'd like.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, one thing that Commissioner O'Malley always says is bring all of these issues back around to the human level, and which is so perfect for this event where we're talking about humanizing these issues. And I think, we really need to, I hope that the members of Congress, especially the appropriators, think about who it is who's coming to SSA. It's across the whole lifespan. When your baby is born and you get a Social Security number at the very beginning, maybe your baby's very premature or born with a significant disability and you need to apply for SSI. That's really hard. It's hard navigating, being in the NICU. And then on top of that, a burdensome application process for a benefit that would allow you to focus on the care of your child. On and on to a parent dying. and needing to get benefits because you've lost their income. And of course, retirement is the most famous, but it's not the only thing that SSA does. People come to SSA in these really, really often, like Darcy said, often really difficult times in their lives. They really need an empathetic person to help guide them through the process. They need speedy service, and they just need our compassion as fellow citizens. And we really need to do better by them. They've earned the benefits, and we need to do better by them.
And Manasi, I'm going to throw the last question to you and ask, what's next for your research? Is there anything you want to preview, and is there anything you want to put in a plug for in terms of research that you would like to see done that would help us shed more light on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of work left to be done. I think the question about the field office openings is a really important one. And I think also, just thinking about more broadly, how do field offices, how does customer service more generally contribute to changes in disability applications and awards? We know that disability applications and awards have been declining for the last more than a decade or so. And at least our back of the envelope calculation suggests that the field office closings that happened between 2020 and 2015 are not sufficient in themselves to explain a lot of that decline. But it would be an interesting question to think about what is the role of customer service more generally, and how would either increases or decreases in the quantity and quality of customer service change disability applications and awards.
I love that. So putting in a plug for anyone watching, who we've got several researchers who are in the Zoom room right now. So take that and run with it, anyone. So thank you so much to all of you for helping us shed some light on this issue today, and in particular to humanize it. And I just want to thank all of our speakers, Jeff Cruz with AFG, Manasi Deshpande, University of Chicago, Darcy Milburn at the ARC, and Kathleen Romig, her very first day over at the Social Security Administration. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thanks to everyone out in cyberspace for joining us for this event. A recording will be available at nasi.org probably in about a week, because the person who does that for us is on a very well-deserved vacation with his children right now. So we're going to let him have a minute to do that. But I'd come back and find the recording in about a week. With that, please join us for future events down the road. And we thank you for being with us today. Thanks, everyone.